I never imagined that on the day my only son got married, I would be drenched in white wine, humiliated in front of 200 guests, and left standing in silence while everyone stared. The glass was cold, but the sting was hot. My cheeks burned, my hair dripped, and my heart clenched so tightly I thought it might stop. I looked around the ballroom and saw nothing but frozen faces and the bright flash of phones capturing every second. Some mouths hung open, some whispered, but no one moved. Not even my son. Vivian Bennett's voice cut the air sharper than the crystal glass she had just emptied across me. A villa and a $33 million resort chain. That's the least a mother can give her son and his bride. Her words echoed against the chandelier-lit ceiling, turning my dignity into a spectacle. She smiled as if she had won a prize. Clara, her daughter and my son's new wife, smirked at my soaked dress. Daniel, my Daniel, stood still as a statue. His eyes avoided mine. He did not defend me. He did not even flinch. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole, but instead, I stood. I felt the cold liquid soaking into the fabric of my dress, clinging to my skin. My hand trembled as I wiped my face. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart, and all I could feel was the weight of 200 eyes slicing into me. Respect had been stripped from me in an instant, and silence filled the room like a verdict. I stepped back, slowly, carefully, like a woman refusing to crumble. My heels clicked against the marble as I moved toward the doors. Each step felt heavier than the last, but I kept going until the air outside wrapped around me. I touched my face with the back of my hand and whispered into my phone, 10 minutes. Walk in when I call. My voice was quiet, but steady. The kind of steady that comes from knowing one call can change everything. Now, before I take you further into what happened that night, let me invite you to stay with me. This isn't just my story. It's a story about dignity stolen and reclaimed, about justice that arrives when no one expects it. If you've ever felt powerless, if you've ever been shamed in public and wished for the strength to rise again, then don't look away. Stay with me until the end. The wine still clung to my skin as I stood in the hallway outside the ballroom. I could hear the muffled sound of music trying to resume inside, as if the band could erase what had just happened. My hands were still shaking, but I held my phone tight, the lifeline in my palm. 10 minutes. I had said 10 minutes, and 10 minutes would be enough. I closed my eyes for a moment, and in the darkness I saw the face of my late husband, Edward. His voice was not loud, but it was always clear. Hide the wealth, live simply, and never let greed find its way into your home. He had built an empire, but he had taught me that the true fortune was not the villa, nor the resorts. It was dignity, respect, and peace. I had lived by those words, even when it meant driving a 15-year-old car and wearing the same navy dress year after year. I had chosen to appear ordinary. Tonight, they thought that made me weak. I opened my eyes. I was not weak. I had endured grief, loneliness, and the cruel tricks of time. What was a splash of wine compared to all of that? Vivian Bennett thought she could strip me of dignity. Clara believed she could laugh at my old shoes, my worn bag, my modest life. Daniel, my own son, blinded by their promises, had stood by silently. The wound cut deeper than the wine ever could, but wounds can be cleaned. Wounds can heal. As I dabbed my face with a tissue from my bag, I heard footsteps behind me. A woman's voice, gentle, uncertain, whispered, "Are you all right, Mrs. Mercer?" It was one of the younger guests, someone I barely knew. She looked horrified at what had just unfolded. I nodded, forcing a smile I did not feel. I'll be fine, I told her, though my chest ached. Fine was not the word. Determined was closer. Ready was truer. Inside the ballroom, Vivian's laughter floated through the door. She can't even handle a little glass of wine, and she calls herself a mercer. The crowd chuckled nervously, desperate to align themselves with the powerful side of the family. That was her game. Public shame, social dominance, crushing someone until they had no choice but to give in. But I had a choice. I always had. I checked my watch. 7 minutes. The call I had made would change everything. I thought about what was coming, and for the first time since the wine hit my skin, I felt warmth. Not from shame, but from resolve. Vivian believed she was untouchable. Clara thought her beauty and charm would secure her future, and Daniel believed he was marrying into fortune. They had no idea that the foundation they stood on was already crumbling. The hallway seemed quieter now. My breathing steadied, my pulse slowed. I looked into a mirror hanging on the wall and studied my reflection. My hair was damp, my makeup smeared, but my eyes, they were clear. Behind the glass, I saw not a victim, but a woman who had survived loss, betrayal, and the heavy burden of secrets. I whispered to my reflection, respect is not given. It is defended. 9 minutes. The doors opened briefly as a waiter slipped out, balancing a tray. Music and laughter spilled into the hall again, but it no longer pierced me. I was past humiliation. I was waiting for justice. 10 minutes. I drew a breath, straightened my shoulders, and tightened my grip on the phone. It was time. I reached for the ballroom doors. When I stepped into the quiet of my car that night, the leather seat cold against the back of my dress, I felt the memories press in on me like an old friend who refuses to leave. My reflection in the rearview mirror was blurred from the streaks of wine and tears, but my mind was sharp, circling back to the path that had brought me here. I am Joanna Mercer, 67 years old, widow of Edward Mercer, and mother of one son, Daniel. For most of the world, I am an aging woman who drives a car more than 15 years old, carries a handbag with worn edges, and wears the same navy dress for every important occasion. That is exactly how I wanted it. People see what they want to see. A modest widow living quietly. They do not see the villa, the chain of resorts, or the fortune my husband built from decades of relentless work. Edward had been more than my partner in marriage. He was my partner in vision. He was a genius in investments, the kind of man who could look at a barren stretch of coastline and imagine a resort where others saw only sand and waves. He had the gift of patience, the discipline to let an idea grow, and the wisdom to hide success when it attracted the wrong eyes. From the first time he handed me a cup of coffee in a chipped mug and told me, "Joe, wealth is safest when it looks invisible," I understood what kind of life we would live. We would never flaunt what we had. We would never let greed smell our door. When Edward passed, I inherited everything. The villa by the ocean, the sprawling resort chain worth $33 million, the accounts, the shares. But with that inheritance came the weight of his philosophy. Live simply, hide the wealth, protect it from those who would devour it. I took his words to heart. I chose old dresses over new gowns, an aging sedan over a luxury car, a small bookshop as my daily comfort instead of endless banquets. Daniel never knew the truth. I raised him to be kind, to value respect, to chase purpose over profit. I wanted him to understand people before he understood money. But as the years passed, I noticed something shift. He wanted more than what we seemed to have. He wanted the kind of lifestyle his friends bragged about, the kind his father had deliberately hidden from him. I thought he would grow out of it. I thought love and character would anchor him. Then Clara Bennett arrived. The first time she stepped into my home, she looked around with the kind of polite smile that masks disdain. I had laid out tea in porcelain cups Edward and I had used for decades, a plate of cookies I had baked myself. She took a bite, murmured a compliment, and then her eyes wandered over the old curtains, the scuffed table, the stacks of books leaning against the walls. Her smile never wavered, but I saw the flicker of judgment, a flicker that burned into memory. Later, when she excused herself to take a phone call, I heard her soft voice through the crack in the kitchen door. It's just humble, too humble. But don't worry, Mom, I'll manage. That was the first time I heard her speak to Vivian. I should have paid more attention then. Clara wrapped Daniel in admiration, laughter, and promises of a future filled with brilliance. She fed his hunger for recognition. She never needed to know the truth of our wealth to decide I was beneath her. To her, I was the obstacle, the woman who held my son's loyalty and whatever scraps of inheritance she imagined existed. Vivian, her mother, came into the picture not long after. She was polished, confident, with a voice that filled every room. Her compliments dripped with condescension. Her questions were daggers wrapped in silk. Joanna, dear, is that the same car you've had all these years? Or, I suppose keeping a bookshop keeps you busy enough. She laughed, and Daniel laughed with her. At first, I told myself it was just their way. People like them measured value in possessions, not in dignity. But the laughter grew sharper and the remarks more pointed. They turned Daniel's eyes away from the quiet respect I had taught him, toward the glittering greed they promised. I still remember Edward's words echoing whenever I felt doubt. Hide the wealth, protect the dignity. That was why I never told Daniel. That was why I drove the old car to his engagement party, even as Clara's family arrived in a limousine. That was why I wore the navy dress, even as Vivian paraded in gowns worth thousands. But humility, I would learn, has a price. The more modestly I lived, the more they believed I was weak. The more I blended into the shadows, the more they thought they could control me. Daniel didn't know that the villa they whispered about was mine. He didn't know the resorts they dreamed of belonged to his mother. He thought I had nothing to offer but love. And in his silence at the wedding, in his failure to defend me, I saw how far he had drifted from the son I raised. The night air outside the ballroom was sharp, carrying the salt of the ocean not far away. I leaned back against the car and let the memories wash over me, bitter as the wine that stained my skin. Clara's eyes when she first stepped into my home, Vivian's smirk at my old handbag, Daniel's growing hunger for more. They all connected like threads leading to this night. I pressed my palm against my chest and whispered to myself, better to live hidden in truth than to shine in lies. That had been Edward's creed, and mine as well. But as I sat there, wet, humiliated, and alone, I realized that sometimes hiding the truth only feeds the greedy. Sometimes dignity must step into the light to defend itself. I glanced once more at the phone in my hand. The call I had made was still echoing in my ears. 10 minutes. 10 minutes until the man I trusted most would walk through those doors and turn humiliation into justice. I fixed my gaze on the ballroom entrance. My son was inside. So were his bride and her mother. They thought they knew who I was. They thought wrong. The days after that wedding rehearsal dinner blurred into a pattern I began to recognize. It wasn't one sharp strike after another. It was steady pressure, the kind you almost don't notice until your breath starts to shorten. Vivian and Clara were experts at it. They knew how to lace cruelty into compliments, how to turn every gathering into a stage where I was the lone fool. It started at a family brunch, held at Daniel and Clara's new apartment. Vivian had insisted on hosting, though I could see it was Clara's design in every polished detail. The gleaming marble counters, the wall of mirrors, the designer chairs. My old sedan parked outside looked like a stray dog among racehorses. We were halfway through coffee when Vivian set down her cup and smiled. "Daniel, darling, you should focus on your future, not your mother's past." Her voice was silk, but the barb beneath it cut deep. The table went silent, and Clara's hand slid over Daniel's, squeezing with practiced grace. I said nothing. I looked at my plate, at the half-eaten croissant, and reminded myself of Edward's words. But inside, something twisted. Respect, dignity, was eroding in front of me, grain by grain. Clara took her turn next, her eyes darting to the keys on the table. "Daniel, maybe one day we'll get you a proper car. You've been patient long enough." Her gaze shifted to me with a smile so sharp it could slice glass. "Of course your mother's car has charm. Antique charm." I forced a smile, but my hand tightened around my cup. Daniel laughed softly, awkwardly, not realizing he was choosing a side with every chuckle. They didn't stop there. At another dinner, Clara leaned across the table, her manicured fingers tapping the stem of her wine glass. "That villa by the coast? It's far too large for one person. Imagine the family gatherings we could host there, Daniel. Imagine the future." She spoke as if I wasn't in the room. Vivian chimed in, her tone casual but firm. "A house like that is wasted on a widow. It needs children, laughter, a real family to fill it." Her eyes fixed on me, daring me to argue. I felt my cheeks flush, my chest tighten. The villa had been Edward's sanctuary, the place he had dreamed into reality from a patch of windswept land. Every corner of it carried his memory. To hear them speak of it like an item on a shopping list was almost unbearable. Still, I said nothing. I had learned that silence can be stronger than words, but silence also cuts. Daniel's silence cut the deepest. He never stopped them. He never said, "That's enough." He never looked at me with the defense I once saw in his eyes as a boy. The pressure grew sharper when a man in a gray suit knocked on my villa door one afternoon. He introduced himself as an appraiser, said he was there to inspect the property for insurance reasons. He carried a clipboard, a practiced smile, and a way of looking around that felt invasive. I hadn't requested any appraisal. I stood at the door, blocking his way, my voice cold. "I didn't authorize this." He shifted uncomfortably, mumbled about paperwork, and left. But the seed was planted. Who had sent him? I didn't need to ask. I already knew. That evening, as I sat in my study, I overheard Clara on the phone. She thought I was in the garden, but her voice carried through the open window. "Once we push her, the villa is ours. The resorts will follow." Her tone was flat, businesslike, as if she were discussing a purchase. My hand froze around the book I had been holding. For a long moment, I could not breathe. I closed the window quietly and sat in the dark. The villa, the resorts, my life's legacy with Edward, were being spoken of as if they were hers to claim. And Daniel, he was the bridge she planned to use. At the next gathering, Vivian struck again. She waited until Daniel had just raised his glass to speak. "It's a pity, Joanna, that you spend your days running that little bookshop. Daniel should be focusing on managing real assets, not his mother's sentimental hobbies." Clara laughed, a tinkling sound, before adding, "Maybe once the villa is in order, Daniel can show everyone he's ready for more." The words were knives, but the deeper cut was the sight of my son nodding, his lips pressing together as if he agreed. I lay awake that night in the villa, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the roof pressing down on me. Edward's picture on the nightstand seemed to watch me. His eyes, always calm, now felt like a question. "How long will you let them strip your dignity, Joe?" I thought of Clara's phone call. "Once we push her, the villa is ours. The resorts will follow." They had shown their hand. This wasn't just humiliation. This was strategy. They were circling me, pressing closer, building the pressure until I broke and handed everything over. But they had underestimated me. I had lived in silence, in modesty, in the armor of humility. They thought that made me weak. What they didn't understand was that humility is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dark. Respect is not a gift. Respect is a fight. My hands no longer trembled. My breath no longer caught. The pressure they had built would not crush me. It would forge me. The knock on my villa door came again, firm and entitled. When I opened it, I wasn't surprised to see the same appraiser standing there with his clipboard. But this time, he wasn't alone. Clara and Vivian flanked him like generals leading a charge. Their faces carried polite smiles, but their eyes gleamed with something harder. "Mrs. Mercer," the man said, adjusting his glasses, "we're here to complete the appraisal. Just a routine valuation for the property." Vivian stepped forward, her perfume arriving before her words. "It's for everyone's benefit, Joanna. We can't have such a grand villa uninsured properly. Think of the risks." She waved a manicured hand toward the appraiser, as if he were doing me a favor. Clara tilted her head sweetly. "And we thought it best to come with him. It's easier when family is present, don't you agree?" Family. The word curled bitterly in my chest. Behind them, Daniel stood with his hands shoved into his pockets. He avoided my eyes, staring at the ground like a boy caught in a lie. My heart squeezed. I wanted to grab him, shake him, remind him of who he was. But I said nothing. "I didn't request an appraisal," I replied, my voice steady, "and you have no right to force one." The appraiser cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mercer, it's just an evaluation, harmless." Vivian's smile sharpened. "Harmless? Don't be dramatic. Daniel needs to plan his future. This villa should already be in his name. We're only trying to help move things along." The words struck like a slap. Edward and I had built this villa together, brick by brick, dream by dream. It was the heart of our life. And now Vivian, who had never spent a night here, spoke of it as though it were her daughter's dowry. Clara touched Daniel's arm, her voice smooth. "Darling, imagine raising our children here. Imagine laughter echoing through the halls instead of..." Silence. Her eyes flicked to me, pitying, cruel. "It's wasted now." Daniel shifted, nodded faintly. My chest tightened. He wasn't defending me. He wasn't defending the home that had raised him. He was yielding, bending under their voices. I drew myself up. "This villa is not yours to appraise, nor yours to imagine. It is mine." Vivian's laugh was low and sharp. "Yours? A lonely widow clinging to walls and memories? Joanna, it's time to face reality." You cannot hold on to everything forever. I watched her, my pulse steady, though my palms burned. Reality is not for you to define, Vivian. The appraiser shifted uncomfortably between us, scribbling on his clipboard though he hadn't set foot inside. The charade was clear. He wasn't here for insurance. He was here to feed their hunger. When they finally left, their perfume lingered longer than their footsteps. I closed the door and leaned against it, pressing my forehead to the wood. The air in the villa felt heavier, as if Edward himself had felt the insult. That evening, I stood at the window overlooking the sea. The tide crashed against the rocks, relentless and unyielding. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, an old woman in a worn sweater. But I knew better. Beneath the modest frame was a fortress they had underestimated. The next weekend, I saw how far they were willing to go. At another family gathering, Vivian raised her glass and declared loudly enough for every guest to hear, "Daniel, once this villa is secured, you'll be able to prove you're ready to manage more. A man must have property to stand on." The room chuckled, polite laughter rippling like poisoned water. Clara leaned in, whispering loudly enough for me to hear. And then the resorts. One step at a time. My breath caught. They weren't hiding it anymore. They weren't playing polite. The villa was step one. The resorts, the empire Edward built, were next. I looked at Daniel. My son. He sat at the head of the table, his shoulders slouched, his lips pressed in a line. He didn't object. He didn't stop them. His silence was agreement, and his silence was betrayal. The humiliation that night wasn't from laughter or spilled wine. It was from the slow, public erosion of everything Edward and I had built, of everything I had protected. It was from watching my son sit among them, nodding while they carved pieces of me into their future plans. When the guests left and the night fell quiet, I walked through the villa alone. My fingers traced the walls, the photographs, the furniture Edward had chosen himself. I thought of the nights he stayed up, sketching designs, calculating risks, telling me, "This will be for you, Joe. So you'll always have a place that's yours." Now Vivian and Clara spoke of it as theirs, as if my memories were furniture to be replaced. I stood in the center of the living room and whispered into the silence, "You built this for me, Edward. I won't let them take it. Not while I'm still breathing." The villa answered with stillness, but the sea beyond roared its approval. I knew then that silence would no longer protect me. They had crossed the line from insult to invasion, from greed whispered to greed declared. The next move would not be theirs. It would be mine. The night after Vivian and Clara marched into my villa with their appraiser, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the lights dimmed. The villa was quiet, but my mind was loud, racing with every insult, every smirk, every nod of silent betrayal from my son. I traced the rim of my teacup and thought of Edward. He had warned me long ago, when greed circles, you don't wait for the bite, you strike first. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Mark Lawson answered on the second ring. His voice was steady, familiar, the same voice that had guided Edward through contracts and negotiations. "Joanna," he said, a hint of surprise. "It's been too long." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Mark, I need you." Quietly. "They've started circling the villa. They've spoken of the resorts. I can't wait any longer." There was no hesitation. "I'll be there in the morning." When he arrived, he carried a leather briefcase, worn but polished, like the man himself. His gray hair had thinned. his face lined with years of battles in courtrooms and boardrooms. But his eyes still held the sharpness of a hawk. He sat across from me at the same kitchen table and listened as I told him everything. Vivian's insults, Clara's sneers, Daniel's silence, the appraiser's visit, and the overheard phone call. When I finished, he opened his briefcase and began laying out folders. I'll start with financials. Vivian Bennett has always lived above her means. If she's pushing this hard, she's desperate, and desperation leaves trails. Within days, Mark returned with a preliminary report. He set the U folder in front of me, the weight of it heavier than any book I'd shelved in my shop. Vivian owes over $12 million, he said plainly. Personal loans, failed investments, private credit lines. She's drowning, Joanna. I blinked, the number dizzying. 12 million. The woman who had humiliated me in front of 200 guests was herself a beggar in pearls. And Clara? I asked, though I already knew the answer wouldn't be kind. Mark flipped another page. She and Daniel are carrying $300,000 in credit card debt, most of it recent. Designer clothes, travel, wedding expenses. The reception alone is already pushing them into the red. He looked at me gravely. It was all on borrowed money. My stomach twisted. So the show, the apartment, the parties, it's all an illusion? Smoke and mirrors, Mark confirmed. Paid with interest they can't afford. They're gambling on your assets, Joanna. Without them, they'll collapse. I pressed my hands together to stop their trembling. My son, my only son, was drowning in debt with a woman who saw my villa as a life raft. My heart ached, but my spine stiffened. They wanted me to believe I was powerless, but they were the ones with nothing beneath their feet. Mark slid another document across the table. There's more. Clara recently contacted a lawyer asking about the process for declaring an elderly parent incompetent. She specifically mentioned you. The words hit harder than Vivian's wineglass ever had. My breath caught, and I gripped the edge of the table. She wants to have me declared unfit? To take control of everything? Mark nodded, his jaw tight. It's called guardianship. If she convinces the court you're unstable, Daniel could be appointed to manage your estate. Given how much they owe, it would mean your entire fortune in their hands. For a moment, the room spun. My son's face flashed before me, not as the man who stood silent at the wedding, but as the boy who once clutched my hand in the schoolyard, who once promised me he'd always protect me when Edward died. And now, he might sign his name on papers that stripped me of everything. Tears pricked my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I straightened my back and closed the folder with firm hands. Then, we won't give them the chance. Mark studied me, his expression softening. Joanna, I've seen clients fold under less. You're stronger than most. I met his gaze, steady. Strength is the only thing keeping me standing. They think humiliation will break me. They think greed will scare me. They don't know who raised Daniel. They don't know who Edward chose as his partner. The rest of the week, Mark and I worked quietly, building files, collecting evidence. He showed me bank statements, loan agreements, copies of Clara's inquiries. Each page was another nail in the coffin they had built for themselves. Ruth, my neighbor and oldest friend, noticed the change in me. One evening, she knocked on my door with a basket of bread. Her kind eyes scanned my face. You're carrying something heavy, Joe. I hesitated, then let her in. Over tea, I told her only part of the truth, that Daniel's new family was pushing, that they wanted the villa. that I feared losing more than walls and windows. She reached across the table and gripped my hand. Then don't let them. You've carried enough loss. Stand, Joe, for Edward, for yourself. Her words echoed with Edward's voice in my memory. Hide the wealth, he had said. But maybe it was time to protect it in another way. Not by hiding, but by fighting. Mark left that night with a promise. I'll prepare the full report, Joanna. When the time comes, you'll be ready. One call, and everything shifts. I walked him to the door, the sea air brushing against us. They believe silence means surrender, I said quietly, but silence is only the pause before justice speaks. He smiled, just a flicker. Then let's make sure justice is loud. As his car pulled away, I stood at the threshold of the villa, clutching the file he had left with me. Debt, lies, manipulation, and a plan to strip me of my very name and dignity. They thought I would crumble under pressure. They didn't understand. Pressure makes stone unbreakable. Mark returned 3 days later carrying a thicker briefcase than before. He walked into my villa with the calm assurance of a man who had seen every scheme, every debt spiral, every desperate trick families play when greed gnaws at them. But his eyes told me this case carried a special weight. He set the briefcase on the table, unlatched it, and spread out papers like a surgeon preparing for operation. Joanna, he said softly, I've compiled everything. It's worse than we thought. He handed me the first stack. Bank statements. Vivian's name appeared again and again, attached to loans from private lenders, all overdue. Her signature sat beneath interest rates that would terrify any rational person. 12 million in debt wasn't the full picture, Mark explained. She's leveraged personal property, investments, even her jewelry. But most of her assets are already seized. She has no path forward without new capital. That capital in her mind is your villa and the resort chain. I ran my finger down the columns of numbers, the black ink stabbing at me like knives. Vivian's polished laughter at the wedding now sounded like the desperate cry of a woman who had bet her future and lost. But her desperation didn't make her less dangerous. It made her ruthless. Mark slid another folder toward me. Here are Clara and Daniel's records. I braced myself. 300,000 in credit card debt had grown closer to 400,000 in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Luxury boutiques, designer gowns, jewelry, even the down payment for their apartment, pulled from credit lines stretched beyond reason. And then there was the wedding itself, every invoice screaming excess. The ballroom alone had cost $250,000, billed to a card with no limit and no plan to pay it. I closed my eyes, pressing the heel of my hand to my forehead. My son, my only son, had stood silent while his bride's mother humiliated me, and now I understood why. He wasn't just silent, he was trapped. They had dangled luxury before him, and he had taken the bait, believing it made him a man. Instead, it made him a debtor. Mark's voice cut through my thoughts. Joanna, this is important. Clara contacted a lawyer named Phillips 2 weeks ago. She asked him how to initiate a guardianship petition. I opened my eyes. Guardianship? He nodded. Yes. It's a legal move where the court declares someone unfit to manage their own affairs. In that case, Daniel, your son, would become your guardian, controlling your estate. With him in their pocket, Vivian and Clara could liquidate everything. The room tilted. My breath grew shallow. I gripped the edge of the table as if it were the only solid thing left in my world. My son, my Daniel, would have the power to strip me of the life Edward built. Worse, he might already be considering it. Mark handed me another document. It was a transcript of an email exchange Clara had with the lawyer. I read the words aloud, my voice trembling. Client inquires, "If my husband's mother is showing signs of instability, can we petition quickly before she changes her will?" I dropped the page, my hands shaking. Instability. That was their weapon. They would paint me as frail, confused, unfit, a widow clinging to old habits, an eccentric woman running a dusty bookshop. They would twist my modest life into evidence of incompetence. I looked up at Mark, my throat raw. They planned to erase me. He leaned forward, his voice steady but fierce. "Then we erase their plan first. You have two advantages, Joanna. One, you are of sound mind, with decades of records proving it. Two, you control the assets. As long as you act decisively, they cannot touch them." I sat back, my chest rising and falling. The weight of betrayal pressed hard, but beneath it, something stronger stirred. Resolve. Edward had trusted me to carry his empire with dignity. I would not let greed devour it. Mark gathered the papers into a neat stack. "There's more. Clara has already hinted to Daniel about power of attorney. She told him it was just in case something happens to your mother." The words hit me harder than I expected. Power of attorney. My son had asked me about it once, casually, as if it were a routine matter. Now I knew where it had come from. Not his concern, but her manipulation. I remembered that moment clearly. Daniel at the kitchen table, his voice hesitant. "Mom, maybe we should talk about, legal paperwork, just so things are easier later." At the time, I had brushed it aside, thinking it was his way of confronting mortality. Now I saw the truth. He was carrying Clara's script. I pressed my hands flat against the table. "Mark, I need to protect the resorts." He nodded. "That chain is their ultimate prize. It's worth more than the villa, more than anything else you own. If they get even partial control, they'll use it to patch every hole in their sinking ship. But I've already drafted measures. We can redirect ownership into a foundation. We can make it untouchable." A foundation. The word settled into my bones like a seed ready to grow. Edward's dream had always been bigger than profit. He had wanted the resorts to outlive us, to serve others, to preserve dignity for generations. Perhaps this was the way. I looked down at the papers scattered across my table, the debts, the lies, the schemes, and I felt something shift inside me. Grief was still there, but rage now stood beside it. Rage not just at Vivian or Clara, but at Daniel, my own flesh and blood, who had let greed blind him to respect. Mark placed a pen in front of me. "Joanna, it's time to decide how to fight back." I picked it up, the weight of it heavier than any sword. "Then we start now," I said, my voice steady. "I will not wait for them to petition a court. I will not wait for my son to sign away my life. If they want war, they'll get it. But it will be on my terms." The villa seemed to breathe with me, its walls strong, its windows steady against the sea wind. I felt Edward's presence in the silence, proud, urging me on. Mark closed the briefcase with a snap. Good, because when the moment comes, one phone call will shift everything. I nodded, fire rising in my chest. Then I'll be ready to make that call. I spent the night pacing the villa, each room echoing with Edward's memory and my own thoughts. The sea pounded against the rocks outside, as though it understood the storm building inside me. The documents Mark had left still covered the table. Pages of debts, letters from lawyers, transcripts of Clara's schemes. I walked past them again and again, reading fragments each time. 12,400,000. Guardianship. Incompetent. Power of attorney. Each word was a nail hammered into my heart. By dawn, I knew there was no more room for silence. I had lived for years under Edward's creed. Hide the wealth, live simply, protect dignity by disappearing into modesty. But now I realized, hiding only fueled their greed. My humility had been twisted into weakness. My silence had been mistaken for surrender. If I wanted dignity restored, I would need to bring the truth into the light. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote 4 words across the top. Better truth than living a lie. Those words would become my armor. When Mark returned that morning, I didn't wait for him to sit down. I handed him the note and said, "It's time. Prepare everything. 10 minutes when I call, that's when you walk in." His sharp eyes studied me. "You're sure?" I nodded, steady. "If I wait any longer, they'll strip me of everything. This way, I strip them first." He opened his briefcase, produced a set of forms, and slid them across the table. "Then we'll act decisively. I've drafted new documents. One removes Daniel as a beneficiary. Another transfers all assets into a charitable foundation, the Mercer Foundation. It will preserve Edward's vision, and it will keep the resorts out of their reach forever." The pen felt heavier than my own hand as I picked it up. My heart squeezed. Removing Daniel from my will was not just a legal step. It was a mother's heartbreak carved into ink. I stared at the line where my signature would go, my chest tight, my throat raw. This was my son, my only son. But he had stood by silently as they humiliated me. He had let them plot to declare me unstable. He had asked about power of attorney with a script Clara had fed him. My eyes stung, but I steadied my hand. Edward would tell me, "Choose dignity over illusion. Choose justice over fear." I signed my name. Mark gathered the pages and placed them into a sealed envelope. "It's done. Daniel no longer inherits a cent. The foundation will hold everything." I exhaled slowly. Relief and sorrow warred inside me. A part of me still longed for the boy who once held my hand in the schoolyard, the boy who once told me he'd always protect me. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who had chosen greed. I could not bring him back by sacrificing myself. Later that afternoon, Ruth came by with her basket of bread, as she always did. She saw the papers on the table, the ink still fresh. She set the basket down and looked at me with concern. "Joe, what have you done?" I told her everything. Her eyes filled with both pride and sadness. "This will destroy your son," she whispered. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the sting of those words. It's better than destroying myself, better than letting Edward's life's work vanish into Vivian's debts. She reached for my hand. "Then let me hold the documents. Keep them safe until the day you need them. If anything happens, I'll ensure they're honored." I pressed the envelope into her palms, my heart heavy. "Thank you, Ruth. You're the family I can trust." That evening, I stood by the window and watched the horizon burn with sunset. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders felt lighter. I had chosen my path. I had armed myself with truth, not silence. They thought they had cornered me. They thought I was weak, but they had mistaken patience for surrender. I whispered into the glass, watching my reflection harden into steel. Respect is not given. Respect is defended. The sea roared back, steady and strong, as if Edward himself were answering. I rehearsed the plan in my mind: the wedding, the humiliation, the glass of wine. Let them have their performance. I would have mine. 10 minutes later, when Mark walked through those doors, the room would shift. The truth would step into the light, and dignity would be restored. I folded my worn navy dress and placed it back in the wardrobe. Tomorrow, I would wear it one last time, not as a symbol of weakness, but as a shield. The same dress they mocked would become the dress I wore when I shattered their illusions. I slept little that night, but when dawn came, I rose with clarity. My steps were sure, my hands steady. I knew what I had to do. The night before Daniel's wedding, the villa felt more like a fortress preparing for battle than a home. I walked through the quiet halls with a candle in hand, the flicker of light brushing across family portraits and Edward's books stacked neatly in the study. Each corner of this house held memories, but tonight, it felt like every wall leaned forward to listen, to bear witness to the decision I had made. On the dining table sat the folder Mark had prepared, documents signed, sealed, and witnessed. My son's name had been struck from my will, his inheritance redirected into the Mercer Foundation. The resorts, the villa, every asset Edward and I had built was no longer bait for Vivian and Clara's greed. It was protected beyond their reach. My hand had trembled when I signed those pages, but not from regret. Trembling was grief, the grief of a mother cutting her son loose. Ruth arrived just as the rain began tapping against the windows. She carried her usual basket, but tonight it was not filled with bread. She set it on the table and carefully lifted out a thick envelope. "These are the copies," she said. "The originals are locked in my safe. If anything happens, Joe, the world will know your wishes." Her voice steadied me. I pressed her hand, the lines of age and trust etched in her skin. "I've asked too much of you already." "You've asked nothing but honesty," she replied softly. "And I've seen enough women silenced in my life. You won't be one of them." The storm outside grew heavier, thunder rolling across the sea. We sat together for a long time, the candlelight between us like a pact. Ruth eventually leaned forward, her brows knitted. "This will destroy your son." I closed my eyes, her words echoing the same warning she had given days earlier. "It's better than destroying myself," I whispered. "It's better than letting them bleed me dry until there's nothing left but shame." She nodded, though sadness lingered in her eyes. She understood. Ruth had raised children of her own. She knew the ache of betrayal. When she left, I walked the villa one last time, as though saying farewell. The rain lashed harder against the windows, and the sea roared beneath the cliffs. In Edward's study, I paused before his photograph. His steady eyes, captured in black and white, met mine. "I've hidden long enough," I told him. "Tomorrow, they'll learn what silence was keeping." The clock struck midnight. I sat at my desk, pen in hand, and wrote a letter addressed simply, "To my son." My words were calm, not angry. I told him I loved him. I told him respect is the only inheritance that matters. I told him greed eats the soul faster than debt ever can. When I finished, I sealed the letter and placed it in the drawer. Whether he ever read it would depend on the choices he made after tomorrow. Sleep did not come. I stood by the window until dawn, watching rain wash the world clean. The villa glistened in the morning light, its stone walls resolute, its garden dripping with water like tears. I bathed, dressed slowly, and chose the navy dress Clara had mocked. Its fabric was worn, but it held the weight of years, of battles fought quietly, of dignity preserved in simplicity. I pinned my hair, straightened my shoulders, and looked at myself in the mirror. Not a victim, not a frail widow, a woman ready to stand. By mid-morning, Mark arrived. He wore a dark suit, crisp and commanding, his briefcase clasped firmly in his hand. He stepped into the foyer and met my eyes. 10 minutes, Joanna. Say the word and I'll walk in. I nodded, my voice steady. 10 minutes. No sooner, no later. We reviewed everything one last time at the kitchen table. He explained the sequence, the revoked guarantees, the unpaid ballroom fees, the sealed documents. I listened, committing each detail to memory. My heart ached for what was coming, but there was no room for doubt. As the hour approached, Ruth returned briefly. She embraced me tightly, whispering, "You are not alone. When you walk into that ballroom, remember 200 eyes will see the truth. Let them see strength." I held her hand. Strength is the only language Vivian understands. When she left, I gathered my things, a handkerchief, my small purse, my phone. Nothing else. Wealth was not measured in what I carried. It was already secured where their hands could not reach. The rain eased as I stepped outside. The car waited at the curb, its paint dulled with years. I climbed in, feeling the seat embrace me like an old friend. On the drive to the hotel, I watched the city blur past, the world oblivious to the storm about to break inside that ballroom. My pulse quickened as the hotel came into view, its golden lights shining against the gray sky. Guests were already arriving, their laughter drifting into the air. I could almost hear Vivian's voice inside, sharp and triumphant, Claire's smile rehearsed, Daniel's silence heavy. I took one last deep breath. Edward's words floated back to me. Wealth is safest when it looks invisible, but dignity must stand in the open. As the car pulled to a stop, I touched the phone in my purse, the lifeline waiting for its signal. One call, 10 minutes, and everything would change. I stepped out into the storm's aftermath, the pavement slick beneath my shoes. Each step toward the hotel doors felt like stepping into destiny. The humiliation had already been written, but so had the answer. Respect was waiting to be reclaimed. I lifted my chin, adjusted the navy dress, and walked inside. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and gold trim, but beneath the surface, it pulsed with tension. I could feel it the moment I walked through the doors. 200 guests turned their heads, whispers rippling like wind through tall grass. They still remembered the rehearsal dinner, the wine splashed across my face. To them, I was the widow too poor, too weak to answer back. Vivian stood near the head table, radiant in emerald silk, holding court with her friends. Her laughter cut through the room, practiced and sharp. Clara stood beside her in white satin, glowing with triumph. And Daniel, my son, looked handsome in his tuxedo, but his eyes were hollow. He glanced at me briefly, then looked away, as though my presence embarrassed him. The music faded as I entered, and for a moment, silence spread. I walked slowly, my navy dress brushing the polished floor, my heels steady against the marble. I carried no glass, no jewelry, no armor but dignity. Every step was deliberate. If they wanted me humiliated, I would give them something else to witness. Resolve. Vivian's smile widened when she saw me. "Well, well," she purred, her voice carrying across the tables. "The guest of honor. Or should I say, the guest who refuses to honor her family." Laughter followed, soft but poisonous. Clara leaned into Daniel and whispered something. her eyes never leaving mine. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Again, silence where a son's defense should have been. I let the moment stretch. My chest rose and fell, but my voice, when it came, was calm. Enjoy your celebration. It may be shorter than you think. Vivian laughed loudly, tossing her head back. Threats from a woman clinging to old curtains and broken cars. Joanna, don't embarrass yourself further. I felt 200 pairs of eyes sharpen, leaning closer. Phones rose discreetly, red lights blinking. The humiliation she had thrown at me before had primed them for spectacle. But tonight, spectacle would belong to me. I reached into my purse and touched the phone. My heart pounded. The moment Edward and I had prepared for in silence was here. My thumb pressed the button, and I whispered into the receiver, "Now." Exactly 10 minutes after I had walked in, the ballroom doors swung open. The sound cracked like thunder. Heads turned, and there he was. Mark Lawson strode in, tall, commanding, his dark suit cutting through the glittering crowd. He carried his leather briefcase, and his expression was stone. Gasps rose from the guests. Cameras tilted. Vivian's smile faltered. Mark did not pause. He crossed the room with the steady gait of a man who had come to settle accounts. When he reached me, he inclined his head briefly, then faced the crowd. His voice carried effortlessly. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mark Lawson. I represent Mrs. Joanna Mercer. There are matters of urgent importance that concern this event, and they must be addressed now." Vivian's face tightened. "This is outrageous. Daniel, stop this nonsense." But Mark had already opened his briefcase. He drew out a stack of papers and held them high. "Effective immediately, all financial guarantees previously extended by Mrs. Mercer to Daniel and Clara Bennett are revoked. This includes the $250,000 payment promised to this ballroom." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The hotel manager, who had been lingering near the back, stepped forward instantly, his expression grim. "Is this true, Mrs. Mercer?" I met his eyes squarely. "It is." The manager's lips pressed into a line. He turned to Vivian and Clara. "Then your payment is due. Tonight." The room erupted in whispers. Phones lifted higher, guests leaning across tables. Clara's face drained of color. Vivian's hand shot out, grabbing Daniel's sleeve. "Do something," she hissed. Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes darted between me, the manager, and the crowd recording every second. Mark's voice cut through the noise again, firm and undeniable. "Furthermore, any claim suggesting Mrs. Mercer is unfit to manage her estate will be considered fraudulent. Evidence has been documented. Attempts to pursue guardianship or power of attorney will be met with immediate counteraction in court." The whispers turned into shocked gasps. Vivian's face twisted, her polished calm breaking for the first time. She hissed, "You had no right." I stepped forward, my voice clear and sharp. "I had every right, and I am not the one drowning in debt." The words struck her like a slap. Gasps rippled again, and the cameras caught every flicker of her face. Clara clutched Daniel's arm, her nails digging in. "Say something, Daniel. Tell her she can't do this." But Daniel remained frozen. His silence screamed louder than any words could. I looked at my son, pain lancing through me. "Respect, Daniel. That was all I ever asked. Dignity. Do you even remember the meaning of the word?" His lips trembled, but he did not answer. Around us, guests whispered furiously, recording, posting, their screens glowing. The story was no longer private. It was leaving this room, carried into the world where humiliation could not be erased. Vivian's voice cracked as she tried to recover. This isn't over. No, I interrupted, my voice like steel. It's already over. You thought you could shame me into surrender. But dignity doesn't bow to greed. Not tonight. Not ever. Applause started from the corner of the room, hesitant but real. A few claps, then more, until the sound spread like fire through the ballroom. 200 witnesses, their faces lit with shock and awe, their hands rising to confirm what they had seen. A widow stripped of dignity, reclaiming it in full view of the world. Vivian's emerald dress shimmered under the lights, but her power had evaporated. Clara's satin glow turned pale under the weight of the crowd, and Daniel, my son, sat caught between them, his silence now a prison of his own making. I lifted my chin, turned to Mark, and nodded. He closed his briefcase with a snap that echoed like a gavel. Justice had entered the room, and justice would stay. The applause still echoed when I stepped forward, the lights glinting off chandeliers above me. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes fixed on me, waiting. My skin no longer burned from humiliation. It burned with fire. I had spent years hiding in simplicity, but tonight there was no reason to hide anymore. They wanted a performance. I would give them the truth. I raised my voice, steady, resonant enough to silence even the whispers. This is not revenge. This is justice. The words rolled across the room, sharp and final. Cameras flashed. A dozen guests gasped. Vivian froze, her glass of champagne trembling in her hand. Clara clutched Daniel's arm as though she could steady her collapsing world with her fingernails. My son looked pale, caught between fear and disbelief. I reached into my purse and drew out a folded sheet. Mark had prepared it for this moment. I held it high. You spoke of my villa as if it were your prize, I said, my gaze locked on Vivian. You mocked my home, my life, my simplicity, but you never understood. The villa is just a piece of stone. What you wanted, what you schemed for, was so much greater. I paused, letting the silence expand. Then I spoke clearly. I am the owner of the Mercer Resort chain, $33 million in assets, built by my husband, Edward, and entrusted to me. The villa you tried to steal is a single brick in the fortress we built together. Gasps rippled like waves across the room. Guests leaned forward. Some clutched their pearls, others covered their mouths. Phones recorded every second. Hashtags were being born in real time. Vivian's face drained of color. You lie. Mark stepped forward, holding up stamped documents. No lie. Verified ownership records. Public filings. Joanna Mercer is the sole owner and executor of the Mercer Resort chain. Every hotel, every villa, every account. The truth is undeniable. Clara's hand slipped from Daniel's arm. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Daniel stared at me as though he'd never seen me before. Mother, all this time, you. I turned to him, my voice breaking for the first time. Yes, Daniel, all this time. I lived simply, not because I had nothing, but because dignity matters more than display. And when you stood silent while they mocked me, you showed me that you valued their greed more than my respect. Tears stung my eyes, but I forced them back. I looked at Vivian and Clara again, my words sharp as glass. When you chose greed over love, when you chose manipulation over honesty, when you chose to humiliate me in public, you lost everything. The crowd murmured, stirred by the rhythm of the words. Some clapped again, louder now, emboldened by the truth rising in the air. Mark handed me another document, and I read aloud, my voice ringing clear. Effective immediately, my will has been revised. Daniel Mercer is no longer a beneficiary of my estate. Every asset, my villa, my accounts, my resort chain, has been placed under the Mercer Foundation for Dignity. Its purpose, to support the elderly, to protect those stripped of respect, to ensure justice lives beyond me. The ballroom erupted. Some gasped, some applauded. A few stood, clapping harder, shouting encouragement. Vivian's hand shook so violently she spilled her champagne down the front of her gown. Clara sank into her chair, white as her wedding dress. Daniel staggered back, his face a canvas of shock and regret. The hotel manager appeared again, his tone clipped. Mrs. Mercer, we will need confirmation of these revoked guarantees for tonight's event. Mark produced the papers with a swift motion. Here it is, signed, sealed, and final. The manager turned to Vivian. Then you owe this ballroom $250,000. Tonight. Gasps broke again. Guests craned their necks, whispering furiously. Phones caught every second. The bride's mother, accused of debt, unable to pay. Clara clutched Daniel's sleeve, whispering frantically. Vivian shouted, You can't do this! This is slander! I raised my chin. It is not slander, it is truth, and truth doesn't need your permission. The applause grew louder, rolling across the room like thunder. Some guests even whistled, others chanting my name softly. 200 witnesses, 200 records of justice, carried out under crystal chandeliers. Daniel stumbled forward, falling to his knees before me. His voice cracked. Mother, please. I didn't know. I didn't understand. I was blinded. Forgive me. I looked down at him, my heart splintering even as resolve held me upright. You remembered my words too late, Daniel. I told you once, always respect dignity. You forgot. And now you must live with what you chose. His head dropped, shoulders shaking. Clara turned away in disgust, whispering furiously to Vivian, but no one listened. The crowd was no longer on their side. I took a deep breath and faced the room. Dignity is not a gift. It is defended. Tonight, I defended mine. And may it remind you all, justice does not whisper. Justice speaks. The ballroom exploded into thunderous applause. Guests stood, clapping, cheering, recording, their voices rising together. The sound washed over me, cleansing the sting of humiliation with waves of respect. Vivian sat frozen, her face pale, her body stiff. Clara hid behind her veil of shame, and Daniel, on his knees, trembled in silence. I turned, nodded once to Mark, and walked toward the doors. The applause followed me out, a chorus of vindication that carried into the night. The moment I turned from the head of the ballroom, the room erupted into chaos. Applause thundered in one corner, gasps and frantic whispers tangled in another. Dozens of phones stayed raised high, screens glowing as they captured every frame, every tear, every trembling hand. The humiliation that had once been mine was now theirs, displayed in full view for 200 witnesses and 1,000 more online before the night was over. Vivian's emerald dress glittered under the lights, but her power was gone. She staggered toward the hotel manager, her voice shrill and breaking. This is absurd! We were promised! Joanna can't revoke the payment like this. She can't! The manager held the documents Mark had handed him, his tone firm. These signatures are binding. Mrs. Mercer has withdrawn all financial support. That leaves a balance of $250,000 due immediately. If payment is not received tonight, we will pursue legal action. Gasps swelled again. Guests leaned closer, whispering furiously. Clara's face went ghostly white. Her wedding gown shimmered like a ghost of the future she thought she had secured. She clutched Daniel's arm, her nails digging into his tuxedo sleeve. "Do something. Daniel, fix this." Daniel swayed as though the weight of every debt, every silence, every betrayal pressed down on him at once. His eyes darted from the manager to me, then back to the crowd. His lips moved, but no words came. The man who had once laughed at their jokes, once nodded in agreement, now looked like a child lost in the storm. Vivian, refusing to yield, turned to the crowd with a desperate smile. "Surely you all understand. This is just a misunderstanding. A family matter. Joanna is confused, unstable. But before she could finish, the ballroom doors burst open again. 2 hotel staff wheeled in a cart stacked with invoices and contracts. The manager lifted one and read aloud. "Outstanding charges for catering, decorations, security, and venue rental, $250,000. Payment required now." The crowd gasped. Someone in the back laughed nervously. Phones zoomed in on the papers. The evidence was undeniable. Vivian's voice cracked as she shouted, "This is an ambush!" Mark's voice cut through the panic, calm but firm. "No, Mrs. Bennett, this is accountability." The guests erupted with whispers. Some clapped softly, others shook their heads. Hashtags were already trending on glowing screens. Mercer Ballroom, mother-in-law exposed, dignity wins. Clara collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling. She pressed them to her face, smearing her makeup. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice ragged. "This can't be happening. Tell them it's not true. Tell them she's lying." But Daniel didn't speak. He dropped to his knees, again, just as he had before, this time sobbing into his hands. His shoulders shook violently. Between choked breaths, he whispered words that broke the last pieces of my heart. "I'm sorry, Mother. I forgot your lessons. I forgot who you raised me to be. And now it's too late." The guests fell into a hush, watching a grown man collapse under the weight of his own choices. A few gasped. Some wiped tears. Others recorded with ruthless fascination. I stood frozen, my hands clenched at my sides, my heart torn between fury and sorrow. This was the son I had raised, the boy who once recited Edward's words with pride, "Always respect dignity." And here he was, broken, begging, but far too late. Vivian's voice rose again, desperate, wild. "Don't listen to her lies. She's vindictive. She's destroying her own son's future." But the crowd had already turned. One woman whispered loudly enough for all to hear, "No, she's reclaiming her dignity." Another added, "She's protecting what's hers. That's justice." Applause rippled again, growing, spreading until it rolled like thunder through the ballroom. Small at first, then swelling until the sound filled every corner of the room. Guests stood, some clapping, some chanting my name. The tide had turned, and there was no stopping it. Vivian shrieked, her face contorted, her control shattered. She reached for Clara, but Clara pulled away, her gown dragging across the floor as she stumbled back. "Mother, stop! Everyone is watching!" And indeed, they were. Cameras flashed, videos streamed live, the story already leaving those walls and racing into the world. By the morning, millions would know what happened. I turned slowly, meeting the eyes of the guests. My voice carried above the applause. Dignity is not for sale. Respect is not a gift to be demanded. Justice is not silence. Tonight you have seen the truth with your own eyes. The manager stepped forward again, his expression unyielding. Mrs. Bennet, unless you provide payment immediately, we will have no choice but to escort you and your party out of the premises. A hush fell. Vivian's face twisted in rage. You wouldn't dare! But the staff behind him were already moving forward, their uniforms crisp, their presence firm. Clara sobbed harder, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. Daniel stayed on his knees, his tears staining the marble floor. The humiliation was complete. They had mocked me with silence, tried to strip me with greed, but tonight, the world watched as greed stripped them instead. I turned my back to them. My heels clicked against the marble, steady and strong. The applause followed me with every step. Some guests rose to their feet, clapping harder, cheering softly, voices calling out, "Bravo, Joanna!" And then, as I reached the doors, the sound I heard was not just applause, it was vindication. I did not look back. Some battles deserve no backward glance. The night after the wedding, I sat alone in the villa, the sea outside whispering against the cliffs. I thought I would finally feel stillness, but the world refused to be quiet. My phone buzzed non-stop on the table. Notifications stacked one over the other, messages, calls, mentions. It was as though the ballroom had followed me home, multiplied 1,000 times over. I finally unlocked the screen. What I saw made my breath catch. The very moment Vivian had splashed wine into my face, the exact second I had whispered into my phone, the doors opening with Mark's arrival, and the moment I revealed the $33 million resort chain, all of it was online. Clips were everywhere, spliced and edited into dramatic montages. One video titled Mother-in-Law Showdown at 250K Wedding had already reached over 5 million views. Another was trending under the hashtag Nush Mercer Ballroom. I clicked one. The comments flooded beneath it. She stood her ground with dignity. Incredible. This is the definition of justice. Vivian thought she was untouchable. Guess not. I wish my mom had this strength. Respect. Respect. The word lit like fire through me. For so long they had stripped it from me with their whispers and their mockery. Now strangers around the world were giving it back. The doorbell rang. It was Ruth, holding her phone out with wide eyes. "Joe, you're everywhere," she said. "Look." We sat at the kitchen table, scrolling together. News outlets had already picked it up. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire widow exposes greedy in-laws at son's wedding." Anchors were discussing it. Morning talk shows replaying the footage. Even late-night comedians had already turned Vivian's shriek into punchlines. Ruth squeezed my hand. "You didn't just defend yourself, Joe. You became a symbol." I stared at the screen, stunned. A symbol. I hadn't meant to become one. I only wanted to reclaim what was mine, to protect Edward's legacy, to salvage dignity from the ashes of humiliation. Yet here it was, millions of people finding their own voice in mine. I scrolled further, and there was Daniel. The video of him falling to his knees had gone viral, too. Some comments were cruel, mocking his weakness. Others were sorrowful. "A son should never betray his mother," one wrote. "But you can see the regret. Too late." My chest tightened. No amount of public victory could erase the private wound. Justice had been served, but it did not fill the empty space of a son's silence. Still, the tide could not be stopped. Reporters camped outside the hotel by morning. Paparazzi hunted Vivian and Clara, flashing cameras into their ashen faces as they left through side doors. Articles laid out Vivian's debts in stark detail, numbers Mark had already shown me now, plastered across the front page. Clara's designer dresses and luxury trips became proof of the very greed they had tried to hide. By noon, a hashtag rose to #1. Worldwide. Dignity restored. People posted their own stories of humiliation, of being silenced, of standing up at last. They called me inspiration, a grandmother who had turned humiliation into fire. One video struck me most. It was a teenage girl sitting cross-legged on her bed, speaking into her phone. When I saw Mrs. Mercer stand there in her old dress and face down people who tried to steal her life, I realized I don't have to let anyone steal my dignity either. The clip had 500,000 likes. I pressed the phone to my chest, tears pricking my eyes. Edward had always said the resorts should be more than profit. They should build respect, community, purpose. Maybe this was the beginning of that dream. But storms leave wreckage behind. That evening, Mark called me. His voice was steady, but urgent. "Vivian isn't done, Joanna. She's already reaching out to attorneys claiming you're unstable. She'll try to spin the humiliation into proof that you acted irrationally. Plan B is underway." I closed my eyes, the words cutting like ice. Of course she wouldn't surrender. Humiliation only fuels the desperate. "Let her try," I whispered. "The world has already seen her greed. They will not believe her lies." "Be careful," Mark warned. "Public favor is with you now, but courts don't run on hashtags. We'll need evidence, documentation, character witnesses. We'll need to prepare for a fight." I agreed, my resolve tightening again. Then we'll fight, not in silence, not in shadows, in the light. After the call, I stepped onto the balcony. The sea stretched black and endless, the waves crashing hard against the rocks. I let the salt air sting my face. Justice was never gentle. It roared, it demanded, it pulled down walls. Tonight, the world had seen dignity rise. Tomorrow, the battle would shift to another field, the courtroom. Behind me, Ruth's voice drifted from the kitchen, reading another headline aloud. "Joe, listen. Mercer widow turns humiliation into justice. Millions applaud." I turned back inside, my chest both heavy and light. Heavy with the fight still ahead, light with the fire that carried me here. Justice had spoken once. It would speak again. The days after the wedding should have been calm. The storm had broken, the humiliation reversed, and dignity restored. Yet I knew Vivian Bennett too well to believe she would stay silent. A woman who built her life on appearances could not accept collapse without striking back. It began with whispers. Articles appeared in smaller papers first, quoting unnamed sources. Concerns grow over billionaire widow's mental state. A line from one column froze me. Erratic behavior at son's wedding raises questions about Joanna Mercer's stability. My stomach knotted. Ruth burst into the villa one morning with her phone shaking in her hand. "Joe, they're trying to smear you." She laid it on the table, scrolling through. Headlines. "Widow's breakdown caught on camera? Is the Mercer estate in jeopardy?" I clenched my jaw, reading the words. They had twisted the videos, selecting frames of me with wine dripping down my face, my hand trembling as I made the call, Daniel on his knees weeping. They ignored the truth, slicing out fragments to make me look fragile, unstable, unfit. By noon, a petition surfaced online. Vivian had gathered signatures from a handful of wedding guests. Her friends, the same ones who laughed at her jokes while I sat silent at their tables. They claimed I had shown disturbing instability, that I was unfit to manage a complex estate. Mark called that evening, his voice tight. Vivian has filed an intent to petition the court for guardianship. She's using those signatures plus the edited videos to claim you acted irrationally. She wants Daniel named as guardian. The words struck like daggers. My own son, the one who had already bent under her will, could be handed legal control over everything Edward built. The villa, the resorts, even the foundation I had created. It would all be theirs to devour. I gripped the phone until my knuckles whitened. Can she succeed? Mark hesitated. She has money for lawyers, influence, and courts can be swayed when family testifies against family. But she underestimated one thing: public sentiment. The unedited videos are still out there, and the world is on your side. That night, I scrolled through social media. For every article calling me unstable, there were 100 voices defending me. Clips from the wedding still flooded timelines. Unedited, unfiltered, undeniable. Millions had seen Vivian sneer, Clara mock, Daniel stay silent. Millions had seen me rise. One comment caught my breath. If Joanna Mercer is unstable, then justice itself is unstable. Stand with Joanna. It had been shared tens of thousands of times. Still, the smear campaign spread. News anchors debated my mental state as though they had known me their whole lives. A tabloid published a photo of me outside the bookshop, claiming I looked frail and disoriented. They didn't know I had simply been tired after shelving boxes of donations. Ruth sat with me at the kitchen table as I scrolled through the mess. They want to break you with lies, she said. But lies can't stand when truth has 200 witnesses. I closed my eyes, hearing Edward's voice again. Dignity must be defended, Joe, even when they call you mad. The next morning, the backlash began to turn. Journalists who had attended the wedding released their own footage, longer clips showing Vivian hurling insults, Clara smirking, and me standing with steady voice. She wasn't unstable, one anchor declared on air. She was unshakable. Hashtags flooded back stronger. Joanna speaks. Justice, not greed. Mother-in-law exposed. A video compilation comparing Vivian's claims with the unedited footage hit 10 million views in 2 days. The caption read simply, "Greed disguises as love. Justice unmasks it." Mark called again, this time sounding more confident. The smear is collapsing. Judges read papers, but they also watch the news. Public outrage is turning Vivian's own weapon against her. We'll prepare our filings, but this petition may already be dead in the water. Still, the battle wasn't over. Vivian appeared on a local talk show, her voice trembling, but her words sharp. I only want what's best for my daughter and her husband. Mrs. Mercer has been confused, erratic. No one wants to say it, but she needs help. The host pressed her. Isn't it true she revealed herself as the owner of a $33 million resort chain? That hardly seems confused. Vivian faltered, her smile cracking. Yes, but why hide it? Only someone unstable would... The clip spread like wildfire. Instead of gaining sympathy, she became the laughingstock of the internet. Memes plastered her face with captions. She hid her wealth responsibly? Must be crazy. The smear campaign backfired spectacularly. The very storm she unleashed to drown me became a wave that dragged her under. Yet the ache inside me remained. Because behind her legal filings, her signatures, her press appearances, stood my son. She had filed the petition in his name, as though he had been the one to say, "My mother is unfit." Whether he had signed it himself or she had pressed his hand onto the page, I didn't know. But the betrayal still cut. I sat on the balcony that night, the sea roaring below, my phone glowing in my lap. Messages poured in from strangers across the world. Elderly women wrote, "You gave me courage." Young people wrote, "You taught me to stand tall." Families wrote, "We showed our children your video." Justice had spoken once, and it was speaking again, not through lawyers or judges, but through millions of voices refusing to believe lies. I whispered into the salt air, as if Edward could hear me. They thought humiliation would break me. They thought lies would silence me. But respect stands taller than greed, and I will stand until the end. The storm of lies was not over, but I was no longer afraid, because the truth was not mine alone anymore. It belonged to everyone who had seen, who had clapped, who had spoken the word dignity like a prayer. The courthouse smelled of oak and paper, the kind of place where truth and lies fight with equal weight until a judge tips the scale. I sat at the long wooden table, hands folded, the navy dress smoothed across my lap. Mark stood beside me, calm and immovable, his briefcase open like a weapon ready for battle. Across the aisle sat Vivian and Clara, their lawyer whispering furiously in their ears. Daniel sat between them, his eyes downcast, his shoulders sagging as if the tuxedo from the wedding still weighed on him. The courtroom buzzed with spectators and journalists. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but pens scratched furiously, and sketches would be splashed across newspapers by nightfall. My humiliation had gone public. Now justice would too. The judge entered, robes flowing, his gavel striking once. "This hearing concerns the petition to declare Mrs. Joanna Mercer unfit to manage her estate. Petitioners, proceed." Vivian's lawyer rose first. His voice was oily, practiced. "Your Honor, my clients present credible evidence that Mrs. Mercer acted irrationally at her son's wedding. She humiliated her family, revoked financial commitments, and revealed a hidden fortune in a way that demonstrates instability. We believe she is no longer capable of managing such a vast estate responsibly." Every word was a knife sharpened against me. Vivian nodded vigorously. Clara dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and Daniel sat still, his silence screaming louder than their lawyer's accusations. Mark rose next. His voice was steady, resonant, the voice of a man who had dismantled lies for decades. "Your Honor, what my clients call instability, the world has called dignity. We present evidence that Mrs. Mercer acted with clarity, intention, and legal authority. Her decision to revoke financial guarantees was not erratic. It was necessary, as the petitioners are drowning in debt." He held up a stack of documents, stamped and verified. Vivian Bennett owes over $12 million. Clara and Daniel Mercer hold nearly $400,000 in credit card debt. The wedding itself was funded entirely on borrowed credit. This was not a family celebration. It was a fraud designed to pressure Mrs. Mercer into surrendering her villa and her resort chain. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Even the judge's brows lifted slightly. Mark continued, his tone sharpening. "And here is the proof of their intent. Correspondence in which Clara Bennett sought legal counsel on how to declare her mother-in-law incompetent before she could change her will. That, Your Honor, is not care for family. That is greed disguised as love." The words rang like a bell. I saw journalists scribbling faster, the phrase already destined for headlines. Vivian shifted uncomfortably, her composure cracking. Clara's face drained pale. Daniel closed his eyes. The judge turned toward me. "Mrs. Mercer, do you wish to speak?" I rose slowly. My knees ached, but my back was straight. I looked at the judge, then at the rows of spectators, and finally at my son. My voice was clear. I am 67 years old. I run a small bookshop. I drive a 15-year-old car. I wear the same dress to every occasion. These are not signs of instability. These are choices. I let the silence stretch before I continued. At that wedding, I was humiliated in front of 200 guests. A glass of wine was thrown in my face because I refused to surrender my villa and my husband's resorts as a gift. My son stood silent. My daughter-in-law smirked. My in-law laughed. And when I walked away, I made a call, not in madness, but in clarity. Because dignity is not for sale, respect cannot be stolen. Justice does not whisper. It speaks. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, listening. I turned to Vivian and Clara. You tried to paint me as unstable because I live simply. But it is not madness to drive an old car. It is not madness to hide wealth from greedy hands. It is wisdom. It is survival. It is strength. The judge nodded slowly, then turned back to Vivian's lawyer. Do you have rebuttal evidence? The lawyer shuffled his papers, his voice faltering. We have testimony from several guests who signed. Mark interrupted smoothly. Your Honor, those guests' testimonies have been contradicted by unedited video evidence. Here are full recordings from the wedding, showing Mrs. Mercer calm, composed, and deliberate, while Mrs. Bennet is seen publicly humiliating her. These videos have been authenticated. The clerk played a clip on the court monitor. Vivian's voice filled the room. A villa and a $33 million resort chain. That's the least a mother can give. The screen froze on the image of wine splashing across my face. Then another clip. Me, standing steady, saying, 10 minutes. Walk in when I call. The contrast was undeniable. The judge's gavel struck. Enough. I have heard sufficient evidence. The courtroom held its breath. Vivian clutched Clara's hand, her face white. Daniel lifted his head at last, eyes wide, lips trembling. The judge spoke clearly, every word echoing in the chamber. The petition is denied. Costs are awarded. Mrs. Mercer remains the sole manager of her estate. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by murmurs of approval. Reporters scribbled furiously. Vivian collapsed into her chair. Clara buried her face in her hands, and Daniel stared at me with eyes full of regret that arrived far too late. The judge paused, then added, Let this be a reminder. Greed may disguise itself as care, but justice unmasks it. Applause broke out from the gallery, rare in a courtroom but unstoppable. The gavel struck again, but the sound of clapping drowned it. When we stepped outside, cameras flashed like lightning. Microphones thrust toward me, voices shouting, Mrs. Mercer, how does it feel to win? What message do you want to send? I lifted my chin, the navy dress catching the light. My voice carried above the chaos. Greed tried to strip me of dignity. Justice gave it back, and dignity, once restored, will never bow again. The crowd roared, journalists shouting, cameras flashing. The clip would play on every screen that night, carried across the nation. That evening, I sat on a talk show, the lights bright, the host smiling. He leaned in and said, Mrs. Mercer, you've become a symbol for millions. What do you want? Them to remember? I looked into the camera, into the eyes of strangers across the country. Remember this. Wealth can vanish, property can be stolen, but dignity is eternal. Respect must be defended, and justice, when it speaks, must be louder than greed. The audience rose to their feet, applauding. Hashtags exploded again. Vivian filed for bankruptcy within the week. Clara vanished from society pages. Daniel lost his job at the firm that had once praised his connections. But I walked out of that studio not as a victim, not even as a widow, but as a woman who had stood when the world tried to break her and taught others to stand too. The days after the court ruling were unlike anything I had ever known. The villa that once felt heavy with silence now glowed with light. Letters poured in, delivered in stacks by the postman, who shook his head in wonder. Messages from strangers across the country filled my mailbox. Some thanked me for standing when they could not. Others shared their own stories of humiliation and quiet battles for dignity. Many simply wrote one word: respect. At the bookshop, where dust once settled quietly on old shelves, customers now came in waves. They wanted to meet me, to shake my hand, to buy a book, just so they could say they had supported the widow who stood her ground. They whispered, "You gave us courage." And every time, my heart tightened with humility. I never sought to be anyone's symbol. I only wanted to protect what Edward and I had built. Yet somehow, justice had turned into something larger than myself. Ruth remained by my side, steady as the tide. One afternoon, she laid a fresh loaf of bread on my kitchen table and smiled gently. "Joe, the world sees you now. What will you do with it?" Her words lingered long after she left. That night, I walked through the villa's halls and thought of Edward. His photo stood on the mantel, his calm eyes forever watching. I touched the frame and whispered, "You said wealth should outlive us, that it should build respect. Maybe now it's time." The next morning, I called Mark. "It's time to finalize the foundation," I said. He arrived with the documents, and together we signed the birth of the Mercer Foundation for Dignity. Its mission was simple: to provide housing, legal aid, and support for the elderly who had been stripped of respect, those who had been silenced, humiliated, or left vulnerable. The first funding came directly from the resorts. $33 million turned from bait for greedy hands into a shield for those who needed it most. At the launch event, cameras flashed, microphones crowded, but I spoke from my heart. "This foundation is not about me," I said. "It is about every person who has ever been told their worth is less because they are old, or poor, or silent. Dignity does not belong to the powerful. It belongs to all of us." The applause was thunderous. Tears streamed down faces in the front row. For the first time in months, I felt not just vindication, but peace. Yet even peace carries shadows. One evening, as I sorted through the growing pile of letters, I found a small envelope tucked between the others. The handwriting was familiar, shaky but clear. It was from Clara. I hesitated before opening it, my chest tightening. Inside was a single page. "I am expecting a child, your grandchild. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I want you to know this. One day, this child will seek you, and I hope you will not close the door." I read the words again and again. My hands trembled, my eyes blurred with tears I thought I no longer had. The wound Daniel left had not healed, but here was a letter that whispered of new life, of possibility, of hope that the cycle of betrayal could be broken by innocence. I folded the letter carefully, placing it in the same drawer where Edward's photo rested. For the first time, the ache in my chest softened. Weeks later, I walked with Ruth along the garden path behind the villa. The camellias Edward had planted bloomed bright against the stone walls. Ruth bent down to touch a petal. "Do you think you'll forgive them?" she asked. I breathed in the salt air, watching the waves crash against the cliffs. "Forgiveness is not for them," I said slowly. It's for me, for the future, for the child who may one day knock on this door." She nodded, her eyes shining. "Then you've already begun." That night, I stood once more on the balcony, the sea stretching endlessly before me. The villa was quiet, but it no longer felt like a fortress under siege. It felt like a lighthouse, standing tall, carrying light for others who had lost their way. I whispered into the night, imagining Edward beside me. "We did it. Dignity stands, justice speaks, and hope lives on." The waves answered, steady and sure, carrying the promise forward. I turned back inside, my heart lighter than it had been in years. The battle was over, but the story was not. A new chapter had begun, one not of humiliation or betrayal, but of healing, of giving, of guarding dignity for those yet to come. And though the wounds of my son's silence still marked me, the thought of a grandchild, an innocent life untainted by greed, sparked a quiet flame in my chest, a flame of hope. Because the cycle was not yet closed, and the future was still unwritten.